See it. A chronicle of the empire of ether and the Great Reset. The Age of Resonance, the pre-flood world, before the mid-1800s, there were no nations as we know them today. There was only a unified, global civilization often referred to as Great Tartaria. This civilization did not burn coal or oil. They had mastered the ether, the invisible, infinite energy field that permeates the universe. The architecture of power, the cathedrals, basilicas, and capitals we see today were not religious or governmental centers originally. They were power plants. The spires, domes, and obelisks acted as antennas, often plated in gold or copper, to harvest atmospheric etheric energy. Cymatic harmony. They understood sound and frequency. The massive pipe organs found in these buildings weren't for hymns. They were sound healing devices that resonated with the water in the human body to cure disease and extend life. The star forts, the geometric, star-shaped fortifications found all over the world, from the Netherlands to Japan to Florida, were not built for defense. They were cymatic water treatment plants, using their geometry to structure water and distribute free energy to the surrounding regions. It was a time of peace, high culture, and giants, quite literally, as the theory suggests humans were larger, lived longer, and coexisted with a unified worldwide architecture, Greco-Roman, neoclassical. 2. The Cataclysm, the Mud Flood. Sometime in the mid-19th century, timeline theories vary between 1800 and 1850, the event occurred. It wasn't a flood of water, but a liquefaction of the soil. Whether caused by a weapon, a deliberate frequency shift, or a natural cyclical reset, the Earth itself turned to soup. A massive wave of soil rose up and swallowed the ground floor of civilization. The evidence remaining. Theorists point to the architectural impossibilities of our cities. The sunken windows. Walk through older cities like New York, London, or Moscow. You will see windows cut off at the sidewalk level, leading into basements. The theory claims these were originally the first floors. The mud flood buried the bottom 10 to 20 feet of every building. The buried doors. During excavations, construction crews often find full doors and archways completely submerged underground, suggesting the street level was once much lower. The population was decimated. The giants died out or were hunted down. The great knowledge of the ether was silenced. 3. The inheritors and the orphan trains. After the dust settled and the mud hardened, a new group emerged. Often called the parasites or the cabal, these were the people who inherited the empty cities. They did not build the magnificent structures of Paris, Washington, D.C., or St. Petersburg. They simply dug them out and moved in. But the world was empty. They needed a workforce. The theory of the orphan trains. This is one of the darker chapters of the lore. In the late 1800s, vast numbers of children were transported across America and Europe on orphan trains. The official story is that they were poor street urchins. The conspiracy story is that these were the repopulation stock, clone batches or survivors gathered to restart civilization with no memory of the past. These foundlings were taught a fabricated history. They were told that men on horseback with chisels built massive granite capitals in 2 years. They were told that the basements were just architectural style choices. IV. The erasure, the world's fairs. The inheritors had a problem. There was too much old world tech lying around that they couldn't explain or control. They needed to destroy the evidence of Tartaria while claiming credit for its grandeur. They staged the world's fairs, Chicago 1893, St. Louis 1904, San Francisco 1915. The lie. We are told these massive, impossible cities, like the White City in Chicago, were built of temporary staff, plaster and hemp, in mere months, only to be torn down after the fair. The truth, per the theory, these were not temporary sets. These were the remaining Tartarian capital cities. The inheritors cleaned them up, turned on the electric lights, which they claimed to have just invented, dazzled the public, and then burned them to the ground. By destroying these cities, they erased the finest examples of etheric technology. They smashed the statues, melted the bells, which were used for frequency generation, not ringing, and introduced the fossil fuel paradigm to enslave humanity through metered energy. V. The Great Reset completed. By the early 20th century, the transition was complete. History was rewritten. The timeline was stretched. The Middle Ages were inserted to push the Golden Age back into distant myth. Science was altered. The concept of the ether was removed from physics, Michelson-Morley experiment, to prevent the rediscovery of free energy. Architecture devolved. We went from the impossible grandeur of stone and marble to the brutalism of concrete and glass. The story goes that we are a species living in the ruins of a greater civilization, suffering from collective amnesia, paying for electricity that used to be free, and walking past half-buried windows without ever asking why. Would you like to dig deeper? Together, these elements form the technical and historical manual for the lost world. 1. The crystalline grid, star forts, bastion forts. Mainstream history calls these bastion forts military fortifications developed in the 15th century to defend against gunpowder artillery. The sharp angles were designed to deflect cannonballs and eliminate dead zones for defensive fire. The Tartaria theory says, this is a cover story for a global energy grid. The global inconsistency. Theorists argue that forts, like Naarden in the Netherlands, Goryokaku in Japan, and Fort Jefferson in Florida are too mathematically precise and widely distributed to be the independent inventions of warring nations. They point out that many of these structures have no defensive value. Some are built on flat ground with no strategic elevation. Some are star-shaped islands in the middle of nowhere, or impossibly complex. The brickwork and geometry are precise to the millimeter, often involving millions of bricks. Theorists argue that mud-shoveling soldiers could not have built these perfectly symmetrical fractals during wartime. Cymatics and water. The key to the star fort is water. Almost all star forts are surrounded by water, moats, or built directly near major bodies of water. Cymatics. In physics, cymatics is the study of visible sound. If you vibrate a plate of sand or water at a specific frequency, it forms a perfect geometric star pattern. The function. The theory claims star forts were frequency modulators. They used the water in the moat as a conductive medium to tune the vibration of the Earth in that region. The result. By structuring the water and the electromagnetic field, these forts created peace fields, or high-yield agricultural zones. They were the power substations of the Old World, keeping the local environment in a state of harmonic resonance. 2. The broken clock, the phantom time hypothesis. If Tartaria was destroyed and recolonized, when did it happen? To hide the proximity of this golden age, the timeline had to be distorted. The mainstream theory, developed by German historian Heribert Illig in the 1990s, the phantom time hypothesis, suggests that the years 614 to 911 AD never happened. The Tartaria integration. Theorists have adapted Illig's idea to explain why we think the Roman Empire fell so long ago. They believe that Dark Ages are a fabrication, empty pages inserted into history books to push the old world further away. The three conspirators. The theory posits that three men conspired to rewrite the calendar: Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. They allegedly wanted to rule during the year 1000 AD, the millennium, because it sounded powerful and religiously significant. Since they were actually living in the 700s, they simply added 297 years to the calendar, fabricated the history of the Carolingian period, and invented the figure of Charlemagne as a backstory to legitimize their rule. The Fomenko expansion. Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko took this further with his new chronology. He argues that ancient history is medieval. The events of ancient Rome, Greece, and Egypt actually happened in the Middle Ages, 1000 to 1500 AD. The duplicate narrative. The history we read is just the same events repeated and renamed to make the timeline look longer. The implication. The Roman Empire was actually the Tartarian Empire, and it fell only a few hundred years ago. We are technically living in the 1700s or 1800s right now, based on the real timeline. 3. Antiquitech, the lost technology. If you look closely at old photographs and religious art, you see the technology of the ether hidden in plain sight. This is collectively called Antiquitech. The cathedral as a circuit board. The theory claims that Gothic cathedrals and capitals are essentially giant electrical components. The spire, antenna. The tall spires reached up into the ionosphere to attract atmospheric charge. The rose window, magnetron. The intricate, circular stained glass windows resemble the cross-section of a magnetron, the component that generates microwaves. Theorists claim these resonated with sound or light frequencies. The organ, Frequency generator, as mentioned before, massive pipe organs generated the specific hertz frequencies needed to manipulate matter or heal the body. The flying buttress. These were not just for structural support. They acted as grounding wires or conductors to channel the energy down into the earth or the water table. Radium and the unlit fireplaces. In many Victorian homes and palaces, you find massive, ornate fireplaces with no soot, no chimney venting, and metal backplates. The theory. These were not for burning wood. They were designed to hold radium or other radioactive, etheric substances. The function. The metal plates radiated distinct ionizing heat that warmed the objects in the room without heating the air, similar to infrared technology today, but powered by the ambient energy collected by the roof antenna, the chimney. The atmospheric railway. There are maps and drawings of pneumatic subways in New York and London from the mid-1800s. The theory. We didn't invent subways, we found them. The old world had a vacuum tube travel system, like a giant bank teller tube, that could shoot pods across continents at hundreds of miles per hour using compressed air pressure. When the inheritors took over, they couldn't maintain the vacuum tech, so they ripped it out and put slow, dirty steam trains in the tunnels instead. The fasces. You often see the symbol of the fasces, a bundle of rods with an axe blade, in government buildings. It's right behind the podium in the U.S. House of Representatives. Official story. It's a Roman symbol of strength through unity. Tartaria story. It is a depiction of a scalar weapon or a tool used for magnetizing stone. The rods represent a bundle of magnets or anodes, and the axe blade focuses the energy. This was the tool used to cut the massive megalithic stones that we can't replicate today. The synthesis. When you combine all three, the picture the conspiracy paints is this. We lived in a timeless era, phantom time, of high civilization, unified by a global energy grid, star forts, using free atmospheric power, antiquitech. A cataclysm occurred, mud flood, the grid was shut down, the timeline was scrambled to confuse the survivors, and we were given combustion engines and tax forms to keep us too busy to notice the massive, silent machines we still live inside. Would you like me? Flood buried the lower levels of the civilization, but the upper levels, the majestic domes, the arches, the antiquitech, were still visible. They were too advanced to explain and too sturdy to simply knock over with sledgehammers. So, the inheritors enacted a scorched earth policy. They didn't just burn the cities, they liquefied them. Here is the story of the great fires of the 19th century, events that mainstream history calls accidents, but which theorists call controlled demolitions. The stone doesn't burn argument. The central premise of this part of the conspiracy is a simple question of material science. How does a city made of stone, brick, and marble burn to the ground? If you drop a match on a granite block, it goes out. If you set a wood fire next to a brick wall, the wood burns, and the brick gets sooted. Yet, if you look at the photographs of Chicago, 1871, Boston, 1872, or San Francisco, 1906, you don't see scorched walls. You see pulverization, the rubble field. Theorists point to photos where massive 10-story stone buildings are reduced to piles of dust and rubble less than 5 feet high. Vitrification. In many of these fires, observers noted that the glass, iron, and stone didn't just break, they melted. Granite turned to plasma. The temperature anomaly. To melt steel and brick, you need temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit sustained for hours. A wood frame house fire burns at about 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. The math, they say, doesn't add up. The theory. These were not chemical fires, combustion. These were electrical fires or attacks using high-powered directed energy technology, similar to the dew theories surrounding modern wildfires. The buildings were destabilized at a molecular level. 2. The schedule of destruction. Theorists argue that the frequency of great fires between 1870 and 1910 is statistically impossible for accidental causes. It was a demolition schedule. 1871, the Great Chicago Fire 1872, the Great Boston Fire 1889, the Great Seattle Fire 1901, the Great Jacksonville Fire 1904, the Great Baltimore Fire 1906, the San Francisco Earthquake, Fire. In every instance, the Old World downtown district, the area with the most arches, domes, and Greco-Roman layouts, was the target. The shanty towns on the outskirts were often left untouched. 3. Case study. The Great Chicago Fire, 1871. The official story. Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern in a barn. The fire spread due to dry weather and wooden sidewalks. The Tartaria story. Mrs. O'Leary and her cow were the cover story for a military-grade clearance operation. The speed. The fire moved faster than a human could run, jumping across the Chicago River, which should have been a natural firebreak. The anomalies. Contemporary reports mention fire falling from the sky and blue flames, indicating chemical or electrical acceleration, rather than orange wood flames. The result. The fire conveniently cleared the exact footprint required to build the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. The inheritors needed a blank slate to stage their temporary plaster city, which was actually the real restored Tartarian capital, before destroying that too. IV. Case study. San Francisco, 1906. The official story. A massive earthquake ruptured gas mains, starting fires that consumed the city. The Tartaria story. The earthquake was a cover, or a man-made resonance event. The real destruction came from the U.S. Army. The dynamite firebreaks. It is a historical fact that the military used dynamite to blow up buildings to create firebreaks to stop the spread. Theorists argue this tactic makes no sense. Blowing up a building just creates more dry debris for the fire. The real purpose. The dynamite was used to level the massive Tartarian structures that the fire couldn't destroy. They were finishing the job. The panorama. The famous panorama photo of ruined San Francisco looks exactly like photos of Dresden or Hiroshima after aerial bombing. There are no half-burned buildings. Everything is sheared off at the foundation. V. The aftermath. The paper cities. Why destroy the solid stone cities of the ancients? To downgrade the tech, the old world homes were heated by radiant etheric fireplaces and lit by ambient energy. By destroying them, the inheritors forced the population into modern, stick-frame houses that required paid utilities, gas, oil, and wired electricity. The fire created the customer base for the fossil fuel industry. To rewrite the code, the old architecture was geometric and harmonically resonant, healing. The new architecture was boxy, discordant, and toxic. It lowered the vibration of the population. The insurance scam. The robber barons, Rockefellers, Morgans, Carnegies, bought the ruined land for pennies, collected the insurance, and then rebuilt the cities using their own steel and oil monopolies. V. The visual proof, as claimed, the most haunting evidence is found in the apocalyptic panoramas. If you search for high-resolution photos of Richmond, 1865, Chicago, 1871, or San Francisco, 1906, you see lone figures standing in a wasteland of bricks. Theorists ask, where are the bodies? Where is the furniture? The ruins are clean. It looks like the buildings had been empty for 100 years before they fell. It reinforces the idea of the post-reset world. The people in the photos didn't build those cities, and they didn't really live in them. They were just the scavengers watching the old world finally fall. Would you like to? There is one final biological component to this theory that explains where the giants went. Would you like to explore the theory of mud fossils and the titans? How mountains and mesas might actually be the petrified remains of massive biological entities. Rabbit hole. The point where the conspiracy moves from reinterpreting architecture to reinterpreting the very ground you walk on. This is the theory of mud fossils and the silicon titans. If the Tartaria theory claims that human history is a lie, the mud fossil theory claims that geology itself is a lie. It posits that the Earth is not a ball of lifeless rock and dirt, but a graveyard of titanic biological entities. The mountains, mesas, and canyon walls are not geological formations. They are the petrified remains of the giants and the world trees that existed before the Great Reset. Here is the story of the biological Earth. The core premise: geology is biology. Mainstream science tells us that rocks are formed by pressure, heat, and time, sedimentary, metamorphic, igneous. The theory claims rocks are petrified soft tissue. The concept relies on a process called nucleophilic substitution. When a biological entity dies and is rapidly submerged in salty, mineral-rich water, like during a global mud flood, the water prevents rot. Over centuries, the minerals in the water, silica, lime, swap places with the organic molecules in the cells. The form remains perfectly preserved, but the composition changes from carbon to stone. Look closely at a steak. It has marbling, fascia, connective tissue, and blood vessels. Look closely at a cliff face. It has layers, white quartz veins, fascia, and iron oxide red staining, blood. The conclusion: that cliff isn't sedimentary rock. It is a cross-section of a titan's muscle tissue. 2. The great tree stumps, silicon life. One of the most viral aspects of this theory concerns the mesas of the world, flat-topped mountains like Devil's Tower in Wyoming or the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. The official story: Devil's Tower is an igneous intrusion, magma pushed up underground and cooled into hexagonal columns. The mud fossil story: it's a tree stump. Look at the shape. It flares at the bottom like a root system. It has a flat top where it was cut. Hexagonal biology: nature builds huge structures using hexagons, honeycombs, plant fibers. The vertical hexagonal columns of Devil's Tower are not cooling cracks. They are the xylem and phloem, transport vessels, of a massive, ancient tree. The Silicon Era. Before our carbon-based life forms, the Earth hosted silicon-based life. These trees reached miles into the atmosphere, connecting the ground to the ether. The harvest. They didn't fall naturally. They were cut. The theory claims that a massive cosmic mining operation arrived, sawed down these world trees, creating the mesas, and harvested the resources, leaving us with a desolate wasteland of stumps. 3. The Titans, the sleeping giants. If the trees were miles high, the inhabitants were equally massive. These are the Titans. You will often see videos of mountains that look suspiciously like faces, or ridge lines that look like a sleeping woman. Pareidolia. Science says this is the human brain seeking patterns, faces, where there are none. Mud fossils. The theory says your eyes are telling you the truth. That mountain is a face. When the Great Flood, cataclysm hit, these titans drowned in the mud. As the waters receded and the mud hardened, their bodies were encased. Over thousands of years, the casing eroded, revealing the profile of a face, a torso, or a limb. The blood of the earth. This explains why deep mines are so hot and why we find oil. Oil is not fossil fuels from dinosaurs. It is the liquefied adipose tissue, fat, and blood of these decaying titans. We are literally powering our cars with the blood of the old gods. IV. The quarry world. This perspective changes the meaning of mining. We aren't mining for minerals, we are scavenging a corpse. Gold and silver. These are the conductive neural pathways of the ancient earth. Clay and mud. This is decomposed flesh. Limestone. This is pulverized bone. The Grand Canyon is not a result of water erosion, which creates V-shaped valleys, not vertical walls. It is an ancient strip mine or a scar left by a massive electrical discharge, a Lichtenberg figure, that ripped the flesh of the earth open. V. The biological evidence, the heart stones. Theorists, most notably a researcher named Roger Spur, claim to have found actual organs turned to stone. They present rocks that, when split open, reveal the precise interior chambers of a heart, complete with ventricles and aorta. They claim that DNA tests on these rocks have returned human results. They point to iron oxide, rust, found in rocks. Iron is the primary component of hemoglobin, blood. A rock shouldn't bleed red rust unless it was once alive. V. The synthesis, the sadness of the reset. When you put the mud fossils together with Tartaria, the story becomes a tragedy of cosmic proportions. The first era, Silicon, Titans, a world of miles-high crystalline trees and titans, living in harmony with a high-energy electrical environment. The first cataclysm, the trees were cut, the titans killed and petrified. The earth became a quarry. The second era, Tartaria, a race of smaller giants, our ancestors, emerged. They built the star forts and capitals on top of the petrified remains of the titans to harness the residual energy. They built a utopia. The second cataclysm, the mud flood, the parasites, initiated the liquefaction event. The soil, the flesh of the titans, rose up and swallowed the Tartarian cities. The current era. We are the inheritors of the rubble. We live in the basements of the Tartarians, who built their cities on the corpses of the Titans. We are small, amnesiac, and disconnected from the true scale of reality. The final narrative